Hello there, Commonwealth from here. What can Nintendo Switch Sports and Zelda Breath of the Wild sequel have in common? They might all take advantage of AMD's new FSR upscaling technology. So what is FSR and how will it improve Nintendo Switch Sports and might improve Zelda Breath of the Wild 2 and possibly even Metroid Prime 4? That is exactly what we'll go over in this video. So buckle in and get ready by pressing that like and subscribe button, and let's jump into the possible future of Zelda from March. That is to say, after Majora's Mask is out of the Nintendo Switch Online N64 expansion pack. FSR stands for FidelityFX Super Resolution. According to the data miner Oatmeal Dome on Twitter, AMD's FidelityFX Super Resolution is an upscaling technique aimed at upscaling low-resolution images at higher resolution. We further researched it through this excellent technical analysis by Digital Foundry, which shows surprisingly visible results from use of this type of technology. In other words, it is definitely technology that future upcoming Nintendo Switch titles from Nintendo in late 2022 and throughout 2023 could take advantage of. Not so different from how Nintendo upgraded their past systems with technology in the past, most notable examples being the FX chip for the first Star Fox, or Rare did for Donkey Kong on the Super Nintendo, plus the expansion pack required to play Majora's Mask and Donkey Kong 64. Though not exactly, as the expansion pack was a new piece of hardware that had to be added to the N64, much like Nvidia's DLSS upscaling technology might be an added feature in a future Nintendo Switch model, or more likely, Nintendo Switch successor. AMD's FSR upscaling technology, on the other hand, is not tied to new hardware additions, can be added to specific titles under development, and doesn't need to be tied directly to a new model but rather new games, like Nintendo Switch Sports. And Zelda Breath of the Wild 2, of course, since the listing of FSR in Nintendo Switch Sports is found within the AGL, which Oatmeal Dome points out is one of Nintendo's core graphics rendering libraries. But why? Since Animal Crossing New Horizons, Super Mario Odyssey, Splatoon 2, and yes, The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild have used the same library. And with an even more impressive sequel for a planned 2022 release, it is clear that Nintendo will do everything they can without upgrading the system itself to offer a more impressive visual experience on the big screen. Oatmeal Dome hints that Nintendo might want to use AMD's FidelityFX Super Resolution for future titles. And to this, I personally think if the game engine allows it and the Nintendo Switch and Nintendo Switch OLED model can handle it, then why shouldn't we experience Zelda Breath of the Wild 2 upscale from 900p to say 1080p and solid 30 frames per second? Isn't this exactly what we want from this sequel in regards to graphics? Pushing the technical limits of the Nintendo Switch even further beyond for this historic 20th Zelda game. The first new Zelda game that might run in 1080p Full HD, at least upscaled on a current Nintendo system. Digital Foundry already demonstrated the impact FSR can have, and with Nintendo experimenting with this technology in Nintendo Switch Sports, it is clear that this is only the beginning or testing ground for bigger Nintendo Switch titles coming in the second half of 2022, possibly beginning as early as Splatoon 3, or at least Xenoblade Chronicles 3 before Breath of the Wild 2, and throughout 2023 of games developed by studios owned by Nintendo. It would be teasing to also include Bayonetta 3 into this as well, but that game is developed by Platinum, so it is harder to give an FSR estimate for a third party, though at the same time Nintendo Switch exclusive title. Either way, AMD's FSR upscaling technology is what seems to be how Nintendo aims to elevate the visuals of remaining Switch games with the hardware they have before releasing any new models or successors. The most immediate beneficiary would no doubt be Xenoblade Chronicles 3 and Zelda Breath of the Wild 2, as Zelda has a lot to prove when it comes to graphical performance after 900p with Breath of the Wild on the Switch and unstable at times 30 frames per second. And even lower than that, we all remember Korok Forest and some of the more dense settlements and areas in that game. Even so, the possible last big title before 2024 that might take full advantage of this sort of DLSS light upscaling technology is not Zelda Breath of the Wild sequel, but more and more likely Metroid Prime 4. A game that we know that retro studios truly want to push the graphics boundaries on the Switch. Games that age better than most other titles, and with a resolution of 1080p thanks to taking advantage of AMD's FSR technology, it is possible to achieve this ambition. Perhaps even with 60 frames per second if we are following an evolved corridor design that we remember well from Metroid Prime and Zelda Skyward Sword HD. Since this is the thing, even Metroid Dread was in 1600 by 900p resolution on the Switch, and the story is pretty similar for almost every Nintendo Switch game that has free cam exploration involved and is not just a specific stage or racing track in say Super Smash Bros. Ultimate and Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, which are two of very few games that are able to achieve 1080p 60 frames per second on the Nintendo Switch. The only 3 dual analog camera examples so far is surprisingly Zelda Skyward Sword HD with its 1080p 60 frames per second milestone. Now, we don't expect a massive free-laid adventure such as Breath of the Wild 2 to run at 60 frames per second, especially not in 1080p, as let's remember, this sequel reuses the entire open world from Breath of the Wild that Breath of the Wild struggled with in the framerate departments at times, and on top of that adds to it both above and underground. Add to this that Super Mario Odyssey also didn't run in 1080p but 900p 50fps, and you see where we are 5 years later. Thus our expectations by using FSR in future Nintendo Switch titles, especially from Nintendo, should be grounded. In other words, don't expect upscaled 4K or even Ultra HD from this upscaling technology. Well, upscaling technology light. But upscale 1080p at 30 frames per second, which is a realistic ambition from Breath of the Wild's 900p, 30 frames per second on the Nintendo Switch. Resolution and performance numbers that were already a step above the Wii U version of the game, which ran at 720p 30 frames per second. Naturally, the long-term dream will be to play the newest open-world Zelda games in upscaled 4K, and maybe even 60 frames per second. That goal that Waikuteru went for in his upscaled 4K 60fps reworking of the second Zelda Breath of the Wild sequel teaser is for the time being simply unachievable with the current Nintendo Switch hardware. The Nintendo Switch OLED model dock might be able to output at a high resolution to our TVs in the future, but only with still not revealed or released hardware. An unknown future that might bring us Nvidia's DLSS upscaling technology. But until that time arrives, we at least have AMD's FidelityFX Super Resolution to push upcoming Nintendo Switch games, starting with Nintendo Switch Sports to a new height, like upscale 1080p on the path to upscale 4K and much further beyond any visible clouds, native 4K. If I was to predict a time frame, I would say that upscale 1080p 30 frames per second could be achieved already this year. And throughout 2023, this will be the standard for new Nintendo Switch games, especially from Nintendo-owned titles. Nintendo Switch Sports since it is already confirmed, Splatoon 3 since we have not confirmed final resolutions yet, and we all remember that Splatoon 2 ranged between 1080p and 864p with a fluctuating frame rate aimed at 60 frames per second docked. Then we obviously have Xenoblade Chronicles 3, which could reach upscaled 900p at launch, seeing that Xenoblade Chronicles 2 from 2020 runs in stable 720p after fluctuating between 540 and 720p docked until then, since its launch in December 2017. Zelda Breath of the Wild 2 on the other hand, as the 20th title in the Zelda series, should definitely reach upscale 1080p 30 frames per second with this technology. Upscaled 4K will have then to be saved for the next open world Zelda game, that one coming around 2027 or 2028. Metroid Prime 4 should also be able to reach 1080p. The same goes for the next 3D Mario game, whether it is Super Mario Odyssey 2 or something else, but also aim for 60 frames per second. After all, the upcoming Nintendo Switch titles in 2022 and 2023 are aiming to up the previous title in both scope and gameplay, so with the AMD FSR software across existing hardware opportunity, there's no doubt that a slight graphical leap should also follow. And it makes sense as summer 2022 marks the beginning of the late stage of Nintendo Switch's lifecycle. Or actually, we might already be in it following Pokemon Legends Arceus. The sequel stage of games that already have an existing installment of impressive scale and scope on the system. Think Splatoon 3 to Splatoon 2, Xenoblade Chronicles 3 to Xenoblade Chronicles 2, and obviously Zelda Breath of the Wild 2 to Zelda Breath of the Wild. Games that will dominate 2022 in their ambition, or possibly all take advantage of technology that is first tested on Nintendo Switch Sports, which we get to try before all the other titles on the way. No doubt, this year is Nintendo's big comeback at full throttle after holding down the brake a little in terms of massive new complete 3D releases from April 2020 to December 2021. We have now seen it with the Mario Kart 8 Deluxe Booster Course Pass that will follow us until the end of 2023 and its inclusion in Nintendo Switch Online expansion pack, which has by the way also seen technical upgrades with new reveals, upcoming lineup, and most recently, the news that Crunchyroll will be a second entertainment app after YouTube to be downloadable from the Nintendo Switch eShop. So anime fans, rejoice. And the same goes of course for all of us Zelda Breath of the Wild 2 fans and Zelda fans in general, or Nintendo Switch fans, and to all of you watching. Especially if you haven't pressed that like and subscribe buttons, be sure to do so, as we are pushing for 300,000 subscribers and getting closer and closer, so we can unlock the big Nintendo Switch OLED model with game giveaway. Oh, and press the notification bell to not miss any future videos like this one and other Nintendo Switch and obviously Zelda Breath of the Wild 2 videos throughout 2022 and further beyond. Last but definitely not least, a big shout out as always to all our patreon.com/CommonRealm patrons, and in particular to role producer Charles Shash. You rock, and please enjoy one or both of these two awesome videos.